So in this video, I'm just going to do a quick recap of the stuff that I said in the previous video talking about the issues of the World Cup in Qatar. But if you want the full details and everything, the video will be in the annotations, and I definitely highly recommend you watch it before watching this. Because this video is basically just going to be that recap plus a bunch of new stuff. On December 2nd, 2010, Qatar won the bid to host the World Cup in 2022. This would be the first ever World Cup hosted in the Middle East, a perfect opportunity to shine a positive light on the region and its culture. However, the problem was, the bid was corrupt. Already, it was pretty suspicious when Qatar won over the highly favored US bid, and the World Cup is usually hosted in the summer. But summers in Qatar can range around 40 to 50 degrees Celsius. Those conditions are quite literally inhumane for football. But over the years, there's been much more concrete evidence building up. Of the 22 voters, 16 were accused of or charged with corruption. Vice President Michel Platini was banned for life in 2015, and President Sepp Blatter was banned for 8 years. More recently though, Sepp Blatter admitted the decision to award Qatar the World Cup was a mistake. Which, you know, great that you said that, but you're still a piece of shit. And then in 2020, US prosecutors revealed new details about 3 South American officials who allegedly had taken million-dollar bribes to support Qatar. One of them was Nicolas Leoz, former president of CONMEBOL. There was also the Garcia report. Again, this is a very brief summary, so if you want the full details, just watch the previous video. The intent of the Garcia report was to investigate the bidding processes of both 2018 and 2022. However, the 350-page report was initially not released in full by FIFA's head of adjudication on ethical matters. Instead, it was a 42-page summary basically clearing Russia and Qatar of any wrongdoing. However, years later, it was released in full after German newspaper Bild announced it had received a copy of the full report and intended to publish it. After the release of all 350 pages, it was quickly revealed that the report in no way had absolved the Qatari bid of any wrongdoing. So that's where we kind of end off with the recap of the corruption at least. But surprisingly, there's even more, and it gets honestly even crazier. Recently, there have been allegations of the Qatari government using espionage. I'm not even kidding. According to an investigation by AP, Qatar sought an edge in securing hosting rights by hiring Kevin Chalker. Chalker was formerly a CIA officer, now turned private contractor, which adds to the troubling history of former US intelligence officers working for foreign governments with questionable human rights records. Chalker and his company, Global Risk Advisors, spied on rival team bids and also officials who voted in 2010. According to SRF Investigative, documents found that the Emir of Qatar had ordered the obtainment of detailed phone and SMS records of several members of the FIFA Executive Committee. Chalker and the GRA also worked for Qatar to make sure no change of positions within FIFA or friendships would jeopardize Qatar's ability to host the tournament. During Project Clockwork, the GRA spied on Peter Hartijay and Frank Lowy. Hartijay and Lowy had been working on the Australian World Cup bid, and the Qatari government wanted their vocal influence neutralized. Another operation, Project Riverbed, sought to neutralize Theo Zwanziger, an operation that costed 10 million. Zwanziger was the president of the German FA up until 2012 and was part of the FIFA Executive Committee up until 2015. What caught the Qataris' attention, however, was when he called the country the cancer of world football, referencing the alleged corruption. In response, the GRA targeted Zwanziger's family by building close relationships with them and creating a network of contacts who worked to influence Zwanziger. Fortunately, though, it didn't really change his opinions that much. The largest and most expensive operation, though, was Project Merciless. It spanned over 5 different continents and costed over 387 million. According to further investigations from the SRF Investigative, one of the main long-term goals for Project Merciless was to know the plans and intentions of various targets in advance. One example includes when Chalker traveled to Zurich and bugged hotel rooms of journalists and FIFA executives. While the dirty work was being done by Kevin Chalker, SRF found out that the CEO of the World Cup Organizing Committee was overseeing the espionage operation. We'll talk more about him later though. Migrants make up 90% of Qatar's workforce, and they are exploited daily. Even before being awarded the World Cup, many global companies were under investigation concerning worker rights in Qatar. In the early stages of World Cup 2022 preparation, migrant workers would seek work in Qatar in hopes for higher wages they can send back home to support their families. In order to do this, the migrant workers would pay sponsors around 500 up to 4,300 USD to get a job. This sponsor system is known as the kafala system. The sponsor would be responsible for wages, living conditions, and entry or exit to Qatar. And in order to appeal to these workers, they would promise things like very good working conditions, excellent living conditions, and better pay. However, once the migrant traveled to their new workplace, they'd quickly realize those were all just lies. But since their passports had been confiscated by sponsors, they wouldn't be able to leave the country. On top of that, they're already in so much debt just paying for this sponsor. So as a result, they're just trapped. They have to work. When it came to the actual contract, wages were significantly less than promised. Overtime was also required and didn't result in any extra incentive. And oftentimes payments would be delayed or even sometimes not even come at all. And then you had the living conditions, which were appalling. Migrant workers would be residing in these cramped, dirty, and unsafe spaces.
This is the life we are living here in Qatar, Doha. This place is very dirty smelling. The life we are living here is hell.
But the most talked about issue amongst all of this would be the working conditions. They are quite literally inhumane. Working conditions often saw migrants working under the sun in scalding hot temperatures. The initial estimated number before a ball was kicked in 2022 was more than 4,000. But just last year, The Guardian reported over 6,500 migrant workers from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka had died in Qatar. Migrant workers did have the ability to report to the authorities if they felt their rights were being violated, but their employers made that nearly impossible. However, in 2020, Qatar introduced reforms to combat workers' rights violations. Workers could now change jobs without permission from their employer. There was also now a new minimum monthly wage. Now, in the video, I said that Qatar needed to make sure to strictly enforce these new reforms. Well, have they? Not really. There's been improvements, but very little. Qatar have a long way to go. Thousands of workers are still being exploited by employers through legal loopholes and lack of enforcement. There are still many workers who are trapped in their jobs because employers are using their powers to cancel visas, renew residence permits, and report workers for trying to secretly leave. The working conditions also haven't improved at all. I mean, it wasn't really listed in the reforms. Migrant workers are still out there working 14 to 18-hour days with really no days off. But if we're talking more about the reforms, the wages haven't really improved either. They're still being delayed, and oftentimes, yes, still migrant workers are not being paid at all. In fact, recently, reports were coming out about how migrants were being forced home way sooner than their contracts had stated. Some were expecting 2 years of work when they only got 10 months. And with that, they lose a lot of their promised salary, are left jobless, and in fear that they won't be able to support their families. And on the topic of wages, by the way, even if they are paid, it is criminally low. The monthly minimum wage in Qatar is 1,000 Qatari Riyal. Keep in mind, this is a monthly wage, so they are earning almost $9 a day. Now take into consideration that Qatar is one of the richest countries in the world when it comes to GDP per capita. By no means, though, is minimum wage just a Qatari problem. It is an everywhere problem. But when it comes to Qatar, 9 USD a day is despicable. Now back to the topic of worker deaths for a second. Hassan Al-Thawadi has repeatedly made it clear that the Guardian's report of 6,500 migrant workers is wrong. Instead, it was just 3 worker-related deaths. He's even gone as far as to say that the report counts the deaths of all migrants throughout the last decade. What he says in these claims is misinformation. Blatant lies to save face. A lot of his evidence comes from the death certificates and how not many list a work-related death as the actual cause. However, Qatar's death certificates are incredibly vague due to them not really conducting meaningful investigations. So what we're left with are descriptions like natural causes or cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest, by the way, is as a result of overwork and extremely hot temperatures. It's not like the migrant workers are predominantly in their 50s and 60s. A lot of them range around 20 to 30 years old, and I'm just saying, 20-year-olds don't just drop dead of a heart attack out of random. There are also arguments that Al-Thawadi is not part of the Qatari state, when in fact, he's part of a key government institution with the Emir as its chair. Not to mention, as seen on the most recent Brain Dead Nevomentary, Qatar's government is still using those camps for journalists they know are coming to the country. Camps that present maybe less than 1% of the migrant workforce in clean conditions.
Are you happy with the accommodation that's being provided?
तुमको जो यहाँ पे accommodation मिला है कैसा है ठीक है अच्छा है खुश हो nice.
It's nice.
Yes.
You can literally see in this guy's eyes and body posture, he doesn't mean that shit at all. Now back to the 6,500 figure. Al-Thawadi says that that's wrong. And he's correct. It's actually more, because these are only reports from South Asian countries. We are still yet to see reports from countries like Kenya and the Philippines. But if you're someone who is challenging that number for the fact that it is fake news and that the number is much less, this isn't just coming from a random article on the internet. The evidence is from actual embassy reports proving these numbers. And if you need more numbers, according to the International Labor Organization, which is a UN agency that works to improve labor conditions all across the world, 500 workers were severely injured while 50 died in 2020 alone. This is after the reforms. Also, I'm just saying, if you're telling your vessel to tell federations to avoid politics during the tournament, I don't know, that just sounds like you're hiding something. When you look at some of these stadiums, you can actually sometimes see the skyline of Qatar's insanely rich cities. And it's grim to even think about, because while workers were killing themselves, they would often see these skylines and actually hear what's going on in these cities in the distance, capturing that false hope they had been lied to about for years. Something I didn't touch on in the last video were women's rights. In Qatar, there is what is known as state-enforced male guardianship laws. These laws require women to have a male guardian's permission to marry regardless of age or former marital status. Once married, a woman can be considered disobedient if she doesn't get permission from her husband for work, travel, leaving the house, or even refusing to have sex with him without a legitimate reason. Women are also not allowed to act like the primary guardian for their children, meaning they don't have authority over their children's schooling, finances, travel, and even medical treatment. Even if the woman is divorced and has custody of the children, she still can't be the primary guardian. And if the father is just straight up dead, then the government takes over. As a result, oftentimes many women end up trapped in abusive relationships out of fear of losing their children. When it comes to schooling, women need male guardian permission to pursue higher education either within the States or abroad. Now, according to the Qatari government, women can act as guardians for their children and do not need permission to accept scholarships or work in the government. However, according to a report from Human Rights Watch, which includes over 70 interviews with women and documents from schools and workplaces in Qatar, the government's claims were very conflicting. And while there are no laws requiring women to have guardian permission to work, there's no law prohibiting discrimination against women in the recruitment process. The government also requires unmarried women under 25 to gain permission from a male guardian to travel abroad. And in a lot of cases, unmarried women are refused urgent health care. They basically have to just suffer in silence until they're married. The restrictions on women in Qatar have taken a massive toll on their mental health, contributing to self-harm, depression, and even suicide. It is simply put a disgrace, and these laws need to be abolished. But these rules also pose an even larger problem. They excuse men's disgusting behavior toward any woman. In 2021, Paula Shitakat, who worked for the World Cup organizing committee, was sexually harassed and threatened to be killed by a man. She reported the incident to the authorities, who did nothing to protect her and instead accused her of having an affair. And lawyers in the country offered her the insane solution of marrying her alleged aggressor to avoid conviction. She refused though and left the country, but still faces charges in Qatar. Women deserve just as much equality as a man. They deserve to be respected and deserve not to fear for their lives at every given moment, and that goes for every country. So out of everything included in that first video, LGBTQ+ was the most controversial, and nothing has changed in terms of the laws. Same-sex marriage is illegal and any same-sex couple is deemed unfit to be a guardian. Employment discrimination based on sexual orientation is not prohibited, and any act promoting same-sex relations can be punishable for up to 7 years in imprisonment. And finally, any LGBTQ+ related content is censored. But what I find really funny about the people who are saying shit like, oh, don't bring that to our country. I hate to break it to you, but these people are already in your country. The issue is these groups aren't very visible or vocal due to the extreme oppression and fear for their lives as a result. There are actually LGBTQ+ dating apps, believe it or not, but people still have to be incredibly careful. Because along with people trying to find their happiness, there are also undercover cops trying to ruin their lives. For example, a gay man from the Philippines who worked in Qatar was lured to a hotel and gang by police. But don't worry guys, you're still allowed to wave your rainbow flags during the tournament, and Qatar has promised an all-inclusive experience. Despite the fact that a recent survey showed that 3 of the 69 hotels on FIFA's official list of recommended accommodations would deny entry to same-sex couples. 20 others said that they would accommodate same-sex couples as long as they didn't show they were publicly gay. And recently, a Qatar World Cup ambassador stated that homosexuality is damage in the mind. Nah, but we're supposed to respect the culture in that, right? Yeah.
Being a good guest is always to understand the country that you're visiting, or the home that you're visiting, or the people that you're visiting, and understanding and appreciating the nuances, appreciating the differences in opinions or differences in values that we may have.
Let me tell you something about this whole respect the culture argument, because it's been used by everyone, including even the Emir of Qatar himself. If we're gonna go by that argument, that homophobia is just a part of Qatar's culture and we should respect it, well, let's just say this. The next time you decide to travel to Europe and experience some Islamophobia, well, I'm sorry, that's just part of Europe's culture. You have to respect that. And hey, if you visit the US and get racially profiled, well, I'm sorry, that's just part of the culture. You gotta respect it. You see how dumb that sounds? Culture is not discrimination towards a certain group of people. Discrimination defiles culture. It is as simple as that. I get it. Religion allows us to find ourselves and find a purpose within our lives. And it allows us to immerse ourselves and grow communities. And I know that it's very difficult to defy the beliefs of religion. But at the same time, we don't have to follow everything from texts written 1,000 years ago. Take the US Constitution, for instance. That was written over 200 years ago. The Second Amendment states that everyone has the right to keep and bear arms. In other words, everyone has a right to own a gun. Keep in mind, when this amendment was created, we had guns that took like maybe, I don't know, like a minute to reload. I don't know anything about guns, I just know they're not AK-47s now. But the country still follows this amendment to this very day, and we have seen many consequences because of that. Listen, we are all people. Some just so happen to have different preferences or feel out of their body, and that's perfectly okay. Anti-LGBTQ+ campaigns will continue to tell you that this is some kind of growing disease or something like that, but it's not. Simply put, more people just feel comfortable to come out. And that again is perfectly fine. Sportswashing isn't anything new. Countries with authoritarian governments like Qatar will often host competitions to sway the common eye from the atrocities. I mean, one of the most popular and earliest forms of sportswashing is the 1936 Olympics. Before the competition, the Nazis actually cleaned up to look better to the rest of the world. They removed any signs like "No Jews Allowed" and also arrested 800+ Romani people, which to an extent isn't too far off what the Qatari government is doing. Organizers will say, well, everyone's welcome, while thousands of gay people are being arrested. But here are other examples of sportswashing. The 1934 World Cup in fascist Italy. The 1978 World Cup was in Argentina during a military dictatorship. You could also pretty much include every single event that has been held in China since the 2000s. And more recently, there was the Saudi Arabian takeover of Newcastle United. Sportswashing doesn't just have to be tournaments though. It can be other ways. For example, David Beckham, who is now like the ambassador of Qatar. Very funny after all his humanitarian work, isn't it? If you want something even more recent, Neymar supported a far-right candidate in Brazil. And here's one that should be talked about more. Every time a US president has thrown a first pitch. But this isn't even the first time that sportswashing has occurred in Qatar. They hosted the Asian Cup back in 2011, long before the mass discussions or any kind of worker reforms. Now, a lot of people have made this argument: why haven't we had this same energy for past World Cups? While these are usually just whataboutisms, just to deflect away from the issue at hand, let me address them. The 2010 South African bid was corrupt. No question about it. There's proof of it. And the 2014 World Cup was also an instance of sportswashing. Brazil had terrible working conditions, long hours, and 8 people died because of it. And on top of that, there were mass protests caused by a multitude of different socioeconomic issues. Now, why weren't these talked about more? I think it really comes down to the accessibility at the time. Compared to now, where social media helps us a lot in finding our news, it just wasn't the same way back in 2014. I mean, hell, 13-year-old me didn't know a single thing going on about the World Cup in 2014 until I watched a John Oliver video. But what about the more recent World Cup in 2018 in Russia, which was just as corrupt as Qatar and is run by an authoritarian government known for its kleptocracy? Opposition to leader Vladimir Putin is often met with violence and even death. A perfect example is one of Putin's biggest opposers, Alexei Navalny, a vocal critic who was poisoned and then imprisoned. And in terms of the working conditions, they were probably just as bad. It's just the fact that Russian officers always arrested people trying to report on it. If it wasn't for that, there would be tons of more reports and probably more than 21 deaths. Oh yeah, not to mention Russia has their own anti-LGBTQ+ laws. Oh, and the numerous war crimes the country has committed. Now, I can't speak for sure because back then, I wasn't fully delving into the news like I am now. But I do remember, for the most part, only seeing articles about the LGBTQ+. If you wanted to go farther than that, you would actually truly have to research it. But now it's been 4 years, and unfortunately, it's in the past. We really can't do anything about it, but what we can do is focus on the future and make sure this never happens again, and that's why we have this energy for Qatar. The government has also gone as far as to pay actors to portray better fan atmospheres in the streets. I'm not even kidding. Just by this image alone, you can tell this was facilitated by the Qatari government. Or better yet, if you're willing to become a tool of propaganda for the state, Qatar will happily pay for your flight and hotel. A few weeks ago, it was revealed that some members from the USA's biggest supporters group, American Outlaws, decided to take him up on that offer. Just how many shills do we have in this country? And I guess it appears all that government damage control over the years has made the Qataris forget they're hosting a tournament. And recently, a Danish TV crew who had a permit to film in public were threatened by Qatari security, with one man even saying he would smash the camera. Keep in mind, the tournament hasn't even started yet. And as said before, Qatar and FIFA are quite literally telling federations to not talk about the politics. I think that really just sums it all up there. It really just tears away from Qatar's legitimacy when they're hosting this World Cup. Because if you don't have any problems in the country, LGBTQ+ people are safe, migrant workers have only died 3 times with construction work, women are more than safe to come to the World Cup, and there was no corruption nor espionage during the World Cup bid, there would be no reason to tell federations this. To really close this off, again, like I said, I will be watching the World Cup, but at the same time, I will never ever hesitate to talk about the issues at hand. However, I do commend those who are going to boycott this tournament. I will not deny their moral superiority over me at all. That being said, if you decide to watch this World Cup or not, remember that these deaths are not just numbers, these abuses are not just numbers, these are people like you and I who are having their lives destroyed or already have had them destroyed. Especially those who have unfortunately passed, their families will never be the same again. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of make a follow-up to that video because I think it really did deserve a follow-up. But of course, a massive shout out to all our patrons, including Janos Balash, Sensley Hank Dennis, Elfavi, Milliway009, Aldipu, Alex Rod, Alta, Amin Suamez, Aresan, Daniel Ortiz, Francisco Hernandez, iShadow Ninja, Juan Leras, Miguel Munoz, Nguyendin Mintang, Return Fire, Rory Burns, Saw, Subscribe to Tendetem, The Motor Drive, Tomicus, Vanilla Mexican 17, Victor, Chris Damasceno, David Dunn, Declan Malloy, Dominic Griffin, Emmett Shea, Lewis, Joe Aparicio, Jordan Clavitt, Mohammed Albokhale, MX Weeb, Patrick Barley, President Pulisic, Unbroken Persona, and Duk Q Fam. If you'd like to join the Patreon, there'll be a link down below and up in the annotations. You can follow my Twitter if you want, follow my Instagram if you'd like, follow my TikTok, trying to get to 15,000 there, and of course, you can follow my semi-active Twitch. But until then, I'll see you guys.